Hi, everybody. It's 5:02, and I think most of the people who RSVP'd may be here, and we may have a few more people, but welcome to today's event with Professor Brian Komei Dempster, an event titled Through Seizure and Silence, Intersections of Race, Disability, and Wartime Incarceration. My name is Duncan Rican-Williams. I'm the director of the USC Ito Center, and we're very glad as the center to be hosting this event, which is the first of a series of events this year that we decided to kind of highlight or spotlight the World War II Japanese American incarceration. And so first, before we get into today's event, I wanted to just remind people that there's something coming up fairly soon on October 1st. It's based around the US Postal Service issuance of a new stamp commemorating the World War II Japanese American both volunteers and draftees who served in World War II. So that event is happening on October 1st. December 11th, again, we are still keeping our ears and eyes, about whether we can in fact gather in person or not. But December 11th, at least on paper, we are hosting something together with the UCLA Asian American Studies Center and the Japanese American National Museum, where the event will take place at the museum in downtown Los Angeles. It's an event around the new publication and translation of the Two Lakes Stockade Diary by Tatsuryusei Inoue. And so that's happening a little bit later in the semester. And then for Day of Remembrance, we are doing an event with Susan Komei's new book. Susan is our professor here at USC. She's a lecturer in the history department and teaches our annually a course on Japanese American World War II incarceration. And she has a new book out from Simon & Schuster. And we have an event celebrating the publication of her book and some of the voices that come therein. So those are some of the upcoming events. And we are really grateful today for Professor Brian Komei Dempster to kind of kick us off in this series in the next couple of months. So I think most of you have already read his bio and so forth, but just in case, he is a professor of rhetoric and language at the University of San Francisco and directs its MA in Asian Pacific Studies. I think I know him best from his work, both in terms of his edited works around the first World War II Japanese American incarceration. The first book I think he did was from our side of the fence, growing up in American concentration camps, and the other book that he edited, Making Home from War, Stories of Japanese American Exile and Resettlement, two important collections that he was the editor for. And of course, his work in poetry, two books that are both award-winning. The first one, Topaz, and the second one, which I think is the subject of some of at least what he'll be talking about today, Seize from 2020. And so with that, I want to kind of spend as much time hearing from Brian Komei Dempster, and then what we'll do after his presentation is I will kick off some of the discussion and questions based on his presentation, and then invite all of you to, if you have questions for him. So with that, let me ask Brian to share his presentation.
Thank you for your gracious introduction, Duncan. I'm really honored to be here today with you. And I want to give a big shout out to Duncan, to Shannon, and I'm going to move to my next slide. There's some other people behind the scenes, Jesse Fair, who's doing tech today and has a very calm, soothing voice and manner. Really appreciate his help. And Jason Webb, who's also associated with the Shinso Ito Center. Also, my publisher, a big shout out to Martha Rhodes, Ryan, Sally, Hannah, and Bridget. They've been so supportive of my two books of poems, and I feel so blessed to have them. And I just put some links so that if you're interested in reading more of what you hear today, you can order directly from the publisher. I love, to support indie presses. So I'd be grateful and humbled if you were more interested. You can check out those links, and I'm sure Duncan and Shannon can provide those later as well. So warm gratitude to everyone. And I'm going to give you a little bit of context about how I'm going to approach today. I'm going to give sort of a combination of a poetry reading, a family history, of sharing the words and the work, but also weaving in what happened to my grandparents, what happened to my mother, and especially with a focus on the Japanese American wartime incarceration. And with my second book, Seize, how does that connect to other forms of seizure, in particular, my son Brendan's medical condition? And what I hope that you take away from today is to start to get a sense of those historical, cultural, personal connections in terms of seizure, that is forced removal, that is assaults against marginalized people, that is medical or other types of conditions that seize the body. And I hope that they resonate with you and also get you to think about your own life, the world at large, other connections that you might make about these issues. And I also hope that it's very helpful to kick off this series for the entire fall in terms of the Japanese American experience. So there will be accompanying visuals for the talk, and some of those will be family photos, some of those will be documents, and I'll explain them as I walk you through them. And around 5:45, we'll transition over to some conversation and Q&A. So this slide in front of you that you see is actually the cover for my first book, Topaz, that Duncan mentioned. And for those of you who are unfamiliar, this is a prison camp in Utah. And my mother, as a young child, was incarcerated there. And because she was so young, does not remember the experience. And so she often explains it as fragments, as things that come in a sort of haze. And this was something that really, really spoke to me as a young writer, trying to retrieve that fragmented history. This is my grandfather, Oji-chan, the Archbishop Nite Nishida, and he founded the Nichiren Buddhist Church of America in 1930-31, opened the church, and this was in San Francisco's Japantown. Here he is in a keisa, which is essentially the attire that he would wear during services. And this picture, I believe, was taken outside of the church. By the way, the church was also the home where they lived, which is something very important in the poems. This is my grandfather, Oji-chan, doing calligraphy, and he was a master calligrapher, and his calligraphy adorned some of the walls of the church and is stored in various archives throughout the Bay Area and in places like the Japanese American National Museum. So if you want to know more about his work, you can also go to the Densho Legacy Project. I mentioned my grandfather because he was a Buddhist priest, he was a master calligrapher, he was a community leader, and as a result, he was targeted as one of the first people taken away shortly after the bombing of Pearl Harbor in December 1941. And he and I had a very close relationship. And to underscore that, I want to show you an interview that I did of him in 1990. This sort of dates my age, which is okay. And there's my somewhat beautiful cursive, or I should say print. And so as he spoke to me about the past, I was transcribing very, very quickly. And I don't know how much of it you can make out, but he was incarcerated in Missoula, Montana, in Fort Sill, Oklahoma, taken by train to Camp Livingston, Louisiana. And later, after many years apart from his family, including my mother, who was in Topaz with my grandmother and my aunts and uncles, after that long separation, they reunited in Crystal City, Texas after the war. And, for those of you out there who are students or are archivists or are researchers, This would be an example of that primary research. And I want to mention that, you know, when I was an undergrad at University of Washington, some of you may be undergrads at USC, I didn't know anything about the Japanese American experience. And it was in my first Asian American Studies class where we were reading a book called Prejudice, War, and the Constitution. And the professor talked about the wholesale forced removal of 120,000 plus Japanese Americans. I was literally in shock. And I remember going home that day and asking my mother, wow, did this really happen? And she said, yes, but I don't remember much of it or any of it because I was so young at the time. And that began a big journey, odyssey, quest that I think is common to many Sansei, Yonsei, Gosei, Japanese Americans like myself, third, fourth, fifth generation, to try to piece together what had happened. And, you know, I think you'll talk to people and their relatives at times, they may tell you we're silent or we're hesitant to talk about it due to the trauma and pain. In this case, my grandfather, he was comfortable speaking about it, and some of the others in the family were. And so I slowly began to learn about what had happened to them. This is my grandmother, Obachon, and she, you know, she really, I would say, held together the church family home. She was a poet, actually. She did tea ceremony. She was very refined, very strong, very gentle. And I would call her the glue and the strength and anchor of the family. And her name is Chioko Ishida. So what I thought I would do is I want to introduce a poem now. And it really articulates some of the themes I've been talking to you about at the outset here. So the Nichiren Buddhist Church of America is where they lived. And this is a current day picture. I was a caretaker there. And it's really a place with a lot of gravitas. And when you walk in there, you do feel a sense of the spirits of the lives that have inhabited. And this was literally the site where my grandfather was taken away shortly after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, and also later where the rest of my maternal family was taken away to Topaz from. So as you look at that building, I'd like you to soak in this poem called Sheer. And Sheer is my own reflections on trying to come to terms with the past. How many men? I don't know. If there were handcuffs, I've not been told. 7 decades later, they're invisible to me and I to them. Through chiffon drapes, my grandfather peered back at my grandmother. Her orange kimono wings rose, fluttered away her children huddling in peach silk quilts. December 1941. On their porch, did he bow his head in prayer or feigned deference as he felt the light around him shift to pearl, then dark? And you can see in front of you the very porch which I'm writing about there, and trying to imagine those many decades ago, him standing there, and how he wanted to both not create a huge amount of conflict because it was a very volatile situation, but that he also showed his strength. And that's what that scene attempts to portray. So that poem is from Topaz, my first book of poetry. And here's a poem, a transcription of Obachon, my grandmother, of a poem that she wrote. And I just wanted you all to see that we're from this lineage of artists, of creators. And I do think that the word, the creation, and in my grandfather's case, calligraphy and prayer, were ways to process the trauma, were ways to express and empower oneself in the face of adversity. And this poem here is about my uncle, who I unfortunately never met, Hidemaru Ishida. And as with many Japanese Americans during World War II who went to fight abroad in order to show their loyalty, he, in the Korean War, fought, but he never returned, and he's been missing in action since 1953. So this is a poem that she wrote, and I'll just read a little bit of it. Mailed mother's sorrow, all mother's grief, how miss their sons, wrote in kana for my son. And so it goes. I'm going to read one more poem from Topaz as a transition. And this transition, what I mean by that is from book 1 to book 2, but also from those forms of seizures and silences and incarcerations that I want to explore with you today. So, thinking of the historical incarceration and thinking of the church where I was a caretaker, there's a temple bell that stands sentry in the front window. And, you know, my son Brendan, who you can see pictured here with me, I would raise his head into the temple bell and we would ring it ever so lightly and it would shimmer and he would giggle. And this is when he was about 1 year old. And this poem is about all that that temple bell held, all that it contained and may have witnessed had it been alive, you know, a sort of personification of the temple bell. This poem's called Temple Bell Lesson. Son, I am weighted. You are light. Our ancestors imprisoned, outcast, in sand, swinging between scorching air and the insult of blizzards. Their skin bronzed and chilled like brass. Listen to their sorrow ringing. Gonna do a little. So that's my version of the temple bell at my house. And now I'm gonna transition into my new book, Seizure, which has been out for about a year. And the painting that you're looking at was done by my mother. Her artist name is Sui Ren. And I'd really appreciate it if you took a few moments to look at the visual and just see what it evokes for you, see what resonates for you. When I look at it, I see blood, I see a forest, I see a brain singed by seizures, I see clouds, I see fog. I wonder what you see. We pored over hundreds of her paintings before we arrived at this one for the book. And I'm just so delighted that my mother has such a part in this book in terms of being the cover of it. Yeah. So this to me really evokes the themes of the book Seizure. And for this presentation, I'm going to read a poem. I'll start. It's, you know, the book is in 4 sections. And shortly in the first section, after we introduce Brendan, my son, the speaker starts to reflect upon what are the connections between having a son, Brendan, who is nonverbal, who has epilepsy and cerebral palsy, who speaks in languages that are non-normative, body language, touch, sight, you know, eye contact. And then having a mother who was incarcerated in Topaz and a grandfather who was also taken away and separated from the family. What are the connections between those seizures? And this poem is what emerged. It's called Seized. By day, by night, in handcuffs, through mind scramble, brain surged, shock of force, body taut, alerted, taken, outside, inside, anytime, any place, no words to explain. My infant mother, 1942, my young son now. The rug, his twisted body, his world inside, and what it does, red flare or white lightning, fried impulse or smoldering heat, a searing of gray or glitter of stars veiled by fog, her fragments, yellow orb, the porch light, shimmer against her face, the cradle, her mother's arms, a blanket's false cover, itch of wool, hives on skin. Things just happen by bus, by train, in war, electric storms, a horse stable, desert, sand swirl and mind gust, thought sparks, word cloudings, mountains spike against white, a guard's boot, trodden syllable, a thorned cage, wing pierced, baby hawk in wire, my barbed string of words, to capture him, capture her. If he never speaks, I carry him. If she cries for her father, grandmother carries her. Someplace, my mother carries what is unremembered, begins to know when I ask. I don't speak of things I can't know, of despair about my son. We never know where we are going, where love will end us. So after the poem Seized, the book progresses through Brendan's journey and our journey as a family after he's diagnosed, the challenges and rewards as a father of having a special needs son. And as it goes into section 2, it starts to connect that not only to Japanese American wartime incarceration, but to such utterances and slurs like Jap by a war veteran who flings that word around and its racist connotations shimmer into the air, and the speaker feels and receives that. And the speaker's father and mother experience that, but the father rebukes the person who said the word, and the speaker witnesses all this. And later in the second section, the connections to other forms of seizure are those forms of racial violence, of homophobic violence. And there's poems about James Byrd and Matthew Shepard and others who have been attacked and murdered due to their race or their sexuality. And I thought those were other forms of seizure, and that just as Japanese Americans were taken away from their homes and put in remote locations, there are others who have been targeted throughout history. And I felt that those connections needed to be acknowledged and needed to be part of the book, because seizure itself is a metaphor. It's something that's universal. So we arrive at the third section of the book, and I'm going to read the opening poem because I want all of you to get a sense of how does this individual seizure of my son Brendan, how does it affect the marriage in particular ways? How does it test it? How does it strengthen it? And what is the path towards resolution? So there's a picture of my son Brendan, and it's after a hospital visit, and he's recovered from a bout of seizures, and he's just recovering and looking peaceful and calm and having that radiance and beauty that I admire in him. This poem is called Broken. The park below gives us fire, orange leaves crackling over green. I gulped coffee as I drove. Grace held the cold cloth on his head. I do, he babbled, his mantra. Our mouths chalked, minds chipped and torn away. He never gets better, I said. Her lips tightened. That doesn't help us. Back to our corners. Another night in ER. 2 bags of fluids through our 8-year-old son. A flock sweeps over, shadows the flame, spiking mercury. The night cracked into ice chips, his skin paling, seizing, stopped. Some couples, like us, end up broken, Grace says, rubs my back. Not us, I tell her, my hand on his chest as he sleeps. Through the window, I see kids swinging into the sky, gulls rising, wings white as Brendan's shirt, the silk of Grace's gown. The long field flickering, she leans against me, our forms resting with his in glass. A whole life of I do. So there's a photo of Grace, my amazing wife, and Brendan, very happy in our converted band. And he, our Odyssey, he sits there in his quote unquote stroller roadster. It's hard to define what it is, but that's his place of safety and comfort. And, he gets the entire back. So he's very happy there. It's his safe, happy place. I wanted you to see another painting of my amazing mother, Renko. And again, her artist name is Sui Ren. And this is a painting that also struck me. And as I looked at it, I see so many associations, but I really felt like in looking at it, it reminded me of the fragmentation and blurriness and hazy memory of the camp experience for her. And at the same time, it has those reds and blues, which are sort of the memories that do break through the haze, right? So this poem closes the 3rd section of the book, and it's written in the voice of my mother. Of course, it's an imagined voice, but based on what she told me. And Tanforan, for those of you who don't know, is a detention center, or say assembly center, that was in San Bruno, California. And it's where many Japanese Americans were taken before they went to Topaz. So like a holding station before they went to Topaz prison camp. And it was like a converted horse stable where they had to stay, and it was muddy and really, really difficult conditions. And so that always struck me that they were essentially treated like animals, like cattle, like horses, and dehumanized. My mother and Tanforan in my mother's voice. Horses live here with us, Mama told me. Straw scratched through, wings hovered above my nose. In the stall, I shuddered underfoot, rope cinched around stomping legs, hooves running near, a wash of noise. There's what you think happened and what really happens. The horses were gone, my sister Taya tells me. Believe this, as a baby, I knew smells of manure. Dirt flaked from my hair. Beneath spouts, I shivered. Needles of ice poured on my skin. I sense it, hands swaddling me in coats. A tag with our prisoner number flapping against my face. Whinnies, moans behind boards. Shh, I kick the air. Flies scatter. People hide. The buzz stops. The ground quiets. Pretend we're horses. Mama's back, a bent saddle I climb on. We gallop across mud, through gates, over fences, a dry green. I think we are far away. All right. So you can look at her painting for a little bit longer, see what it evokes. I'm going to close today's talk with two poems, and these are from the final section of the book. And what I hope that you get a sense of as I read these two poems is a sense of the arc, narrative, and trajectory of the book Seize, but even the trajectory across my two books together. My first book, Topaz, is primarily about the speaker's quest to return to the family church in San Francisco, to go through an archive of camp letters, of objects like steamer trunks, of reading, censored blackout letters and trying to figure out what were my aunts and uncles writing to my grandfather when they were in camp, and trying to put together those shattered shards of the past, and then coming to some sort of understanding of what happened during World War II and beginning to have a picture of Topaz. Seize continues that journey, but what is foregrounded is the father and son. And that quest is, of course, historically linked to what happened, but it's also that emotional processing of trying to come to acceptance of having a son who is different, who is nonverbal, especially as a poet, when you rely on language to articulate your son. And one thing that I think ties together the collections is Buddhism, is spirituality. And if you think back to the photos of my grandfather at the beginning of the presentation, and then you look at my son, Brendan, now sitting on the couch, you feel and see a connection between them. And I felt that connection when I wrote that poem of ancestry, of Buddhism, of my grandfather up to my son and all that history. So this poem, Sun Sutra, S-O-N, Sutra, right? It is honoring Buddhism, it is honoring Brendan, and it's a double acrostic. And so it honors him by spelling Brendan down the left-hand side and Brendan down the right-hand side of the page. And if you get the book, you'll be able to see that on the page. Sun Sutra. Boy of stars, sun inside, fallen without a sob. Rest against me, bending sunflower. Still the flutter. Ease your head, son, it's late. No way to before. Your skull shadowed and sunlit. Turn, deepen us with your shadow words, muted sun. Say dad after me. Your scattered sun petals, our sutra, nightfall. I gather you, my bruised son. Brendan often sits that way in a sort of lotus position, and I do think of Buddha beneath the tree. He is beyond language, he is beyond words, but I still do my best to capture him in these poems. So I'm going to close with this poem, and to tie everything together in terms of today's talk, I really thought this was the poem to end on. And it's the journey completed, in my view. And there's my mother, who as a child was incarcerated in Topaz. And there's my son, Brendan, who is her grandson, right? And, you know, my mom's a painter, and my father is a trombonist, and my brother is a cello player. And there's a poem called Golden Oak in which you get the sense of music being shared with my son in that language of music. And then there's painting of my mother. So there's all these forms of art that I think go beyond language. And I think of this when I wrote this poem. My mother watches horses with Brendan. And again, this is in her voice, and it's reflecting upon what does this all mean to her as a mother, as a grandmother, as a painter, as someone who is incarcerated. My mother watches horses with Brendan. Through the fence, you look out, their hooves breaking new earth. Sleek fur, the shade of bourbon, kicking up clods of green. I wheel you closer to shaken ground. Grandson, at 10 years old, you pointed them. Once I thought you said the word horse. Someday I'll paint you the story. Topaz rain galloped over roofs, barracks thundered. We were the ones corralled. My hands on your shoulders, your hand taps my wrist. Look, they are flying over crests of hills, running into the sky. Go far enough, speak what you can. There's love in silence. All things, they come and go. Domo arigato gozaimashita. I'm now going to stop my share, and I will let Duncan transition us into the next part of the program.
Okay, thank you so much, Brian, for sharing that and for this wonderful kind of reciting of poetry, but also giving us not only the context for them, but how they all are kind of like this interlinked verses that extend back to your first book of poetry as well. And so, you know, I'm gonna let people just think through questions they may want to ask you, but just if you don't mind, I'm gonna start in with a few questions and thoughts and so forth. And the first one that's coming to my mind, you know, you ended with your mom and your son, and that kind of idea of like intergenerational, what would one call it, inheritance, or in Buddhist terms, let's call it the karma of what we inherit. I feel like there's these things where, you know, you alluded to like your grandfather's calligraphy and your grandmother's poetry and your mother's paint, like this kind of lineage of that which you as a poet and artist and thinking, you know, using words and not words and Buddhism, not like, it's kind of some things that you inherit. And then there's this kind of other sense I got from you about like, there's also trauma that's inherited. There's a lineage of seizure, there's a lineage of brokenness, there's a lineage of things that might be fragmentary and so on. So I wondered if you can maybe start with that a little bit, if you can kind of tease that out a little bit further about what your thinking is around kind of like both the kind of things that get transmitted that you can kind of be inspired by, but also the things that, because they're broken and not fixed, or wounded and not healed, or kind of in a in a state of seizure and tightness that's not released, and so forth. If you can kind of tease that out a little bit more in terms of how intergenerationally that seems to work for your family, but also I wonder if you could kind of think about that perhaps more broadly about the Japanese American community today, like in terms of what's received, inherited, and so forth, what's constrained, what's been released, and what that process seems like, through the prism of your family, but also if you have a thought about the kind of broader communities as a whole.
Yeah, that's a lot to soak in. Very wise what you're saying, Duncan. I would start with, in terms of the inherited trauma and thinking of my younger self, I would start with the idea of feeling betrayed by my education, of feeling that histories were suppressed that I was unaware of. And so I think the initial catalyst is actually anger, and feeling, wow, how could I have not learned about this in a history course? How could this be one line or paragraph in a book? And then coming to terms with the fact that my own family had not told me about it, and trying to be compassionate and understanding that itself is a reaction to trauma, right? That the reason my uncles were hesitant, the reason that they had withheld, kodomo no tame, for the sake of the children, and there's a sort of protectiveness that surrounds that silence. And this happens with the Holocaust too, right? That we hear about the younger generation. So there's this very complicated swirl where there's anger and shame and compassion and love and understanding for not having received that all together at once. And I think then there's a movement. For me, the artistic forms have to do with empowerment. They have to do with agency. They have to do with healing and processing the trauma. And, I do believe that for my grandmother wrote that poem about her son who's missing in action. And I'm sure for my grandfather, when he's incarcerated behind barbed wire, having calligraphy, having prayer as a way to come to terms with what's out of your control, those seizures, it had to have helped. It had to have been empowering. And then, for my mother as a painter, for my father as a musician, as well as my brother, having those forms for themselves. And for me as a poet, having words did and does serve that form of empowerment. It does not mean, however, that you gloss over the truth. And I think that in your art, you have to honor the trauma itself. You have to express it. You have to make it real and make life complicated and rich as you can through those expressions. And so, when you hear those poems, if you feel unsettled, or if you feel pain, or if you feel those emotions, I think that's fine. I think that would be an expected reaction. And even when you write them, you may have those feelings as well. That being said, though, that's why I wanted to make that point at the end, that there had to be the poems of redemption and the closing of the circle of grief and trauma towards the end of the seas. And that was natural. It wasn't forced or contrived. It was, as a father, I have come to terms with my son, Brendan. And the camps, as much as I was enraged when I learned about them, I have to accept what happens. We have no choice, right? But again, I think that art gives a voice to what happened. It can serve as a form of social justice and political consciousness. And I do think narratives and stories in poems or other genres, they have the ability to connect emotionally with audiences and readers. So, when you say, we cannot let history repeat itself, we cannot let this happen again, well, those are abstract statements. But I do think we need art, and not just poems, but other forms of art, to move people to want to make that change. And I don't want to say art is activism in and of itself. I think activism has a great place, and that's also something else that's important. But I think that it goes hand in hand with activism. It goes hand in hand with social justice. So that's a broad stroke, and I hope I answered your question. I'm glad to elaborate on anything I didn't cover, but those are what come to me, Duncan, those ideas as you share that important wisdom with me. Yeah.
Thank you. Just because we're Japan Studies Center, I was also reflecting a little bit about the Japanese word for seizure.
Yeah.
Hossa, it means seizure or spasm or something like that. And it's made up of these two kanji characters. One, hatsu, usually means departure, going towards something. And then saku usually means, a piece of like a piece of poetry, like a body of work or a production of some kind, or in agriculture, saku means, a harvest. But and so I've always kind of wondered, like, how does those two characters kind of come to mean the notion of seizure in general, and tenkan hosa, I think, is for the epileptic kind of, but also it's used like shinzo hosa, like for a heart attack and things like that. It's a character set of characters that it indicates something about like being in a state where you're not fully resolved, or a state of being in between something and something. And so that thought was going through my mind. And just because yesterday we read for a different thing that we're doing at our center, which is about Japanese American and Black reparations, we read Catherine Frank's book about the moment right after the Civil War where Northern troops are arriving in the South, and there's this proclamation of emancipation, and yet there's this kind of like lack of real repair of the wound of slavery. And she makes this distinction between being free and being freed with the D. And she calls that state of being freed like, you've landed off a shipwreck on an island, but you have nothing, no tools to kind of know what to do then. And so you're in this kind of, so you're not in, so her argument is like, you're not enslaved, but you're not free. You're in this state called freed with this deed. And it made me think about this idea of kind of like, when we think about seizure or being seized or putting constraints, or kind of like there's this kind of tightening, and it's not quite free and not yet, and not in others not fully resolved and yet not something else. It's something in between. Anyway, it's slightly random how I'm kind of like conceiving of all of this, but I wondered if you could kind of give us a little bit more about your sense of how this word seizure in English kind of like has been, you've been using that as the kind of like framing for your work sometimes.
Yeah, thank you for all of that. And so much is going through my mind as you say that, but maybe we could think of that idea of the unresolved state, the in-between state, and the difficulty of resolution, right? And of being free yet not free, right? That paradox. So if you think about it, right, if you take it from the Japanese American perspective, being incarcerated behind barbed wire, that would be the seized state. But the mind and the spirit they have agency, right? And so I think about, how did my grandparents and how did my maternal family survive that trauma? And it had to have been that other form of being in the state of, I can go outside my circumstance. Even though I'm imprisoned, I have art, I have spirituality, I have imagination, and I have family and community behind the barbed wire. And so I think that living in the camps must have felt like unresolved, like I am trapped, but yet I have to make the most of it. I have to find beauty here. Otherwise, it will kill me. Otherwise, it will destroy me, right? And I think Japanese Americans, I just admire their perseverance and strength. Now, taking that metaphor and then jumping into my identity, I would look at the mixed race idea of half Japanese, half European American, the unresolved state of race. And the poem Jap that I mentioned, it's titled that, about the slur, is about feeling almost split as that slur goes through the air, and seeing, the white father attempt to rebuke the person who says the slur, the mother who is labeled and marginalized through the slur, and then feeling that sense of I'm in between states and I'm too young to speak up and to talk against this intimidating war veteran as a young man, but I know something's deeply wrong. And then going to Brendan and what happened to him, we learned about his diagnosis probably between 1 and 2 years old. Before that, we knew nothing was wrong as first-time parents. But it's almost like there's two levels of it. One is, as a parent, you have the ideal and expectation, and that might be freedom. And then you get the diagnosis and it feels like a seizure to you, that your freedom is being taken away. But to him, being so young, he maybe does not have that consciousness, but when he has the physical epileptic seizure, that must feel like an imprisonment, right? I have no control over what happens to my body. And then when the seizure releases and ends, then his mind clarifies. Then he's able to stand and walk again. And so as I wrote the book, right, and as I thought about this metaphor, it actually allowed me to tie together all those stages, right? Like the historical ancestral past, the mixed race adolescence, and the condition of my son. And then also, as I mentioned before, what has happened to African Americans? What has happened to, others like Matthew Shepard in Laramie, Wyoming? And those seizures that deeply disturb me, I realize it's because they're all interconnected in my consciousness. And I think that as an artist, and in the book Seize, I think there's a lot of the unresolved state. And it's like a Hollywood movie when everything ends with a bow and you feel so good, but it's not realistic. And so I think that the way the book ends is that we're still in the unresolved state, but we've managed to find joy, acceptance, and grace in accepting the dissonance of the past, of Brendan's condition. So it's not that it's denied or suppressed, it's that it's completely embraced, and that it's like the positive definition of seizure, Dead Poet Society, Carpe Diem, you seize back your experience, you take hold of it, and you have autonomy and agency. And so I want the book to have that positive idea of seize as a verb, that I own this, that I accept and embrace this, and in all its unresolved complexity, that's okay.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for that. I have a bunch of other questions, but I also want to open it up to people who are with us today as attendees. And we have a question from one of the attendees, Lillian, who says, Brian, thank you for this beautiful reading. I have a question about how you combine your research and your poetry writing. Do you do your research and then set it aside when you write, or do you combine the times when you're doing research with when you're writing?
Hi, Lillian. Lillian is a friend of both Duncan and me, right? Like we both know Lillian, and she has her own wonderful books, novels, and edited anthologies of Wakako Yamauchi. So please check out her work. Lillian, thank you so much. I think that research, it's really how you define that, right? For me as an artist, research has a very broad definition versus me as an academic. So if I go with the poetic definition of research, that would be walking and observing the world. It would be watching a documentary that has some relevance to themes I'm writing about. It could be reading scholarly texts about the Japanese American experience or epilepsy It could be nonfiction, fiction, So I guess the best way to describe it is that I see it as a very porous boundary, and it's not very regimented, right? So if I'm reading something and suddenly I'm going to go write a poem, I allow that to happen. I put down the book, I start writing, and vice versa. I think like a really specific example would be this poem Transaction in Topaz. And I'd seen this documentary, I believe it's called Who Killed Vincent Chin? And it's a very powerful documentary. And the hate crime that happened to him in Detroit, mistaken as a Japanese auto worker. And it led to all this Asian American advocacy. So I'd seen that documentary at some point, and these guys got like 3 years probation for murdering Asian American. And then I was reading the Prejudice, War, and the Constitution book I told you about, but also the Wartime Relocation like Commission report, which is a lot of factual evidence, but it really struck me as I was reading that about some of the realities that like Japanese Americans got $20,000 redress checks after the 1980s movement. And there's just some other factual things. If they own cameras, if they own knives, those were considered dangerous and evidence of them being spies. So I'm reading all this stuff and I'm assimilating all of it. And suddenly I write this poem where my mother receives a redress check. The narrator's talking about an adolescent experience where he's experimenting with sexuality. And then the hate crime of Vincent Chin. Those three things converge into narratives that intertwine and resonate with one another. And I certainly think, quote unquote, the idea of research filtered into the artistic expression, but it wasn't a planned thing. It just was an organic moment that happened after assimilating all those texts and experiences. So I would say that smaller focused example is probably representative of my artistic process. And, I receive the world in the form of books, in the form of experiences, film, and all that would be my research. And even outings with my son into the world would count too as my research. And so I feel like it's very much interchanged and simultaneous and organic.
Thanks for that kind of writing and process reflection. If I could just go back, I want to talk about one of the poems you raised, Sun Sutra.
Yeah.
I titled the book I put out a couple of years ago
Yes.
called American Sutra, and
That's yes.
because I'm in the field of Buddhist studies, some people gave me a little pushback on it as to like the correct use of a term like sutra and putting adjectival things like American in front of it. But I think it was one of those things where I was trying to make the case that the lived experience of peoples contain a lesson,
Yeah.
and that the teachings of the Buddha is not abstract, but in real lives,
Right.
and that people persisting in their faith during the war is a kind of testament to what the teachings actually are. And of course, in the book I wrote, it had to also do with these, you talked about your grandfather, Nitte Ishida, but there's another Nichiren Buddhist priest, Murakita Nikan, who we believe was involved in the writing out of a sutra on stones and burying them in Heart Mountain and things like that. So it makes reference to that kind of thing about like buried sutras and teachings and what can be retrieved when we look more closely. But I wondered if you could share a little bit about your thinking about titling that poem, Sun Sutra.
Yeah. Well, I did think of your book, honestly, Duncan. As I was preparing the presentation, I did want to have some resonance with, frankly, your work, amazing work that you're doing. And of course, the idea of spirituality. And, the way I grew up with it is we would go to my grandfather's church, Nichiren Buddhist Church of America, and we'd be chanting the Lotus Sutra, right? And as a child, I didn't know Japanese, but we were like Nam-myoho Renge Kyo and all these other manifestations. And I found the sounds and the sense of, I don't know, warmth, I guess is what I'm looking for. And the burning incense in that altar room, it brought me such nostalgia and such a sense of community. And it's just embedded in me as a child, those chants and the purple book and the gold leaf pages. And I guess the word I think of in terms of my son is some sutras to me, because of their softness or gentleness, feel almost like lullabies. They feel soothing to me. And even though I didn't understand the words as a child, I felt so soothed and comforted by them. So when I wrote the poem, I was thinking, okay, my son, there's the Lotus Sutra, and my mother is Renko, named after the lotus. And so what does that mean in terms of my son, Brendan? And I wanted the feel of the poem to be like a lullaby. And I wanted it to be comforting, and I wanted it to be soothing. And what I did during the pandemic is I would read that poem to Brendan. He was very, very, he could sense the psychic dissension in the world and the dissonance, but he couldn't verbalize it. And he'd sometimes wake up in the middle of the night screaming when the pandemic started, what happened to our lives? Why are we shut down? And I would read him Sun Sutra, boy of stars, sun inside, fallen without a song. And I'd read it almost like my grandfather would chant the Lotus Sutra. And he would go, hi, hi, hi. And I think he received it the way I received my grandfather's sutras. And I think that it calmed and soothed him, even though he couldn't tell me. So those are my thoughts. I'm not an expert in the area like you are, but that was the artistic connection and personal connection it had for me.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. You know, it is true, like sometimes in monasteries, we say when you're chanting the sutras, sometimes it's about chanting for meaning, but other times it's chanting to create a field or a sonic field, and that you're chanting, especially if you chant with others. It's less about the particulars of words in the sutra, but more about the feeling and effect that it can create by its utterance. You know, so I appreciate the notion of a calming lullaby-esque way of understanding the word sutra.
Yeah.
Well, you know, we have gone over the hour, and so we don't want to, you know, bleed into people's dinner time. But if there are any final questions, please do put it into the Q&A. Obviously, my hope is that Brian will be getting a bunch of your books at our center, but I'm also hoping that people will you know, go further and read up on Seize, but also Topaz, plus any other of your writing. But maybe I wonder if you could kind of help us come to kind of wrap things up in terms of where, you know, this was written kind of in a, or released, I guess, in the pandemic period, and there's a certain kind of constraint of that period as well that we're not fully out of. And I wondered if you could say a little bit about, you know, the kind of mindset of writing and releasing the book in this context compared to, let's say, some of your other publications, which you would have audiences that you could read to, and you know, we're having to do this kind of Zoom thing, you know. But I wonder if you could say something about having a work like this come out in this kind of moment.
Yeah, thank you, Duncan. Yeah, so when the book came out in September 2020, so it's a little over a year. I think it was September 8th that it was released. And yeah, I mean, some of my colleagues had books released in March of 2020, which was right when the pandemic started. And so they had like 40 to 50 readings lined up and had to basically cancel all of them. And so one thing that was good is that I could prepare, right, knowing that this was going to be the case. And I really didn't know. I didn't know what kind of territory we were getting into, but I thought to myself, and this kind of fits with the theme of today, is that, I can either be disempowered and really, really have a sort of sense of maybe passive and feel like everything's out of my control, or I can focus on what I can control. And so, I've done over 15 readings, between about 15 and 20 since it started. And of course, there's Zoom exhaustion. Of course, there's a sense of, as we go on and on and on, that there may be diminishing attendance at certain readings. Not this one, of course, but just in general, that sense of people like, oh, not another Zoom reading. So one reason I started to incorporate PowerPoints like today's is to do something different, to also give the readers a sense of that warmth and that sense of connection that they would get in person if we could be in person, and also be able to visualize and not to be like every other Zoom presentation, and to think of, what if someone's more visual? What if they're more auditory? And so I found that for me, it also made it more enjoyable and engaging to change up the presentation formats and styles. The other thing, Duncan, and I don't know if you've experienced this, because I'm sure you've been doing a bunch of stuff too, is in a way it allowed more people to attend, right? Like, so my parents have gone to, I think, every single presentation. They live in Seattle, and there's just no way that would have happened if we were in person. But yeah, you're right. I mean, I do miss, after the reading, being able to sign books and talk to people in person. And that's been difficult, but at the same time, there's been these unforeseen rewards. And I really give a lot of credit to my publisher, Four-Way Books, who I mentioned earlier. They've been so amazing in helping me line up some great opportunities and in promoting those, and just being really, really incredible people. So it was, I foresaw it as extremely challenging, but it's been more rewarding than I could have imagined. And I'll just end today and close today by saying that the emotional support that people have given me in terms of these poems, which feel quite vulnerable, has been incredibly appreciated. And I'm so grateful for that, because I think beyond the pandemic, just publishing this book was a bit anxiety provoking for me because of what I was sharing. And I think having people be very receptive and supportive has been incredibly, in a way, healing, actually. And it's taking me out of some of that unresolved state that we talked about, and feeling a sense of closure and healing. So I'll let you have the last word, but before, Duncan, you wrap it up officially, I just want to thank you so much for your insights. It was a really, really great conversation. I enjoyed it a lot, and it really made me probe and think deeply about the work. So thank you for that. I want to thank Shannon for everything she's done in putting this together, and Jesse behind the scenes, making sure the tech went well. I want to thank all of you in the audience, Lillian, my parents, and others who are here today, for just being here and listening. That means a lot to me. And, I hope that you continue to come to these events that Duncan is hosting, and learning more about the great things the center is doing. And so I end with gratitude and hand it off to my friend Duncan to close.
Thanks so much, Brian. I think today we had an event commemorating the 40th anniversary of the commission hearings in Chicago. And, after the war ended and the whole kind of process of redress and reparation and how to handle that came about, the commission hearings where often, Brian, as you kind of intimated, not
Yeah.
every family was maybe as talkative as your grandfather, like wouldn't share
Right.
their hard experiences of World War II. And these hearings were often the first time that they broke that silence. And in that there was some healing. And it just reminded me a little bit about that notion of, you were talking about, your some like there's the not verbal, the silent, and yet you are also doing the work to uh,
Hmm.
put it into words. And there's that kind of real crux in Buddhist thought about like words and beyond words, and
Mm.
and and also the power of the not the Buddha's first sermon was nonverbal. He showed a flower, and only one disciple, Mahakashapa, kind of got it. And after that, the Buddha realized he needed to use words. But somehow the power of also non-words in the tradition, but also the power of words. And I
Hmm.
feel like you've been kind of wonderfully straddling in this new work with some of those really deep things that are just these enduring things of like what the non-verbalization and what that holds, and
Mm.
yet also how when we put words on it, there is uh, there's something transformative that happens as well. And so thank you for your work, and really appreciate your taking time today to help kick us off on this series of talks and on this subject. So thank you so much, Brian, and thank you all for attending.
It's been a pleasure and an honor. Thank you, Duncan.